Hello and welcome to another episode of Community Relations Corner, where we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community and our friends and partners all over the city. And I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, coming to you today from our offices on 34th Street in Manhattan. On each episode of Community Relations Corner, we are joined by guests representing the political, governmental, religious, and diverse community leadership in New York. And together we discuss current events impacting the New York Jewish community and its many neighbors, as well as the state of our city, the state of our state, and the state of the world at times, obviously the state of the nation. This episode is sponsored by the Free Synagogue of Flushing, serving the Reformed Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org for information about their Shabbat and holiday services, weekly Sunday school, and the beautiful spaces available for public rental. Once again, visit freesynagogueflushing.org. Thank you very much to our wonderful sponsor. Now on to today's program. Exactly 1 year ago, on December 10th, 2019, as I think we all know, because I saw it on the news today, two assailants murdered Detective Joseph Seals and drove to the Jersey City kosher supermarket. There they exited their van and opened fire, killing Mindy Ferenz, the store owner, Douglas Miguel Rodriguez, who worked there, and a rabbinical student, Moshe Deutsch, who was purchasing some food at the time. While this incident shocked the Jewish community and the nation, it wouldn't be the last. Several more anti-Semitic incidents were perpetrated upon Jewish communities during that month's observance of Hanukkah, including a bloody attack in a rabbi's home in Monsey, New York, where a man entered brandishing a machete and began slashing those attending a Hanukkah celebration. 5 Hasidic Jews were stabbed, and one, Joseph Newman, died of his injuries a few months later. While this evening we celebrate the first night of Hanukkah and hope for a peaceful holiday, hate crimes are very much on our minds. To allay our fears, we are dependent on law enforcement agencies, and here in New York, very much so on the New York Police Department. To engage in conversation with us in this regard, we welcome our very good friend, Deputy Inspector Mark Molinari, Commanding Officer of NYPD's Hate Crimes Task Force. Welcome, Inspector. Wonderful to have you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I appreciate being here.
So first question for you is, how and when did the Hate Crimes Task Force, we'll call the HCTF, come into existence? What was the catalyst behind its creation? Was there a specific incident, a rise in hate crimes, a change in the state laws, or a combination of many factors?
That is a great question for this time of year. New Year's Eve is going to be the 40th anniversary of the NYPD having a unit investigating hate crimes. Back in the late 70s, 78, 79, there was a series of very vicious anti-gay attacks in the city. And then Mayor Koch pushed the NYPD to create a unit to work on these. And they created the Bias Incident Investigation Unit.
Originally was called Bias Incident Investigation.
Bias Incident Investigation Unit was the first name. Now, what's interesting about that is the hate crime law that we use to prosecute hate crime criminals right now wasn't signed into law until the year 2000. So for 20 years, the NYPD was investigating and tracking hate crimes, chronicling hate crimes, running stats on hate crimes without a law to really prosecute somebody as being guilty of a hate crime. Around the same time that law was signed in 2000, the NYPD changed the name to the Hate Crime Task Force.
So let's deal with hate crimes. And many of our viewers who are watching live, and some will watch it later, want to know how a hate crime is determined. What difference does it make if it's a hate crime, or when it comes to prosecution and sentencing, or resources utilized by NYPD in investigating? What happens when you are told that something has been perpetrated that maybe, how does all this happen?
That's a lot of questions that I could take up an hour answering. So let me try to condense it down into an order. Hate crime is really determined by the hate crime law that I mentioned, signed in 2000 in the New York State Penal Law. There's a section for hate crimes, and it defines what a hate crime is. It defines the protected identity groups. So let's start there. The easiest definition of a hate crime from that law, the shortest version, is a crime motivated in whole or substantial part by the identity of the victim. And the victim could be a person or a place.
Yeah.
The identity groups are, a lot of common knowledge: race, religion, national origin, ancestry, sexual orientation, gender, age, disability. I always miss one or two, but you get the idea. There's 10 of them. So that law was created. It defines what a hate crime is. It defines the crimes that have to be committed to make it a hate crime. But what really serves as is a sentence enhancer. For those who know, or I'll give you a very brief version of it, the New York State Penal Law, crimes are divided by felonies and misdemeanors. Felonies are ranked by order of severity, A through E, A being the most serious. Misdemeanors are A and B, A being the most serious. But that hate crime law is an enhancer. So it could take a D felony and turn it into a C felony. It bumps it up one letter closer to the top. And what the real impetus of this is that when judges sentence criminals, defendants, they use that letter grade as a determinant on how long this person should be in prison. So a D felony could get you, let's say, just an example, 3 to 5 years. A C felony can get you 5 to 7 years. So they use that as an enhancer to punish somebody more appropriately for the act they did, not just the crime, but their motivation behind it.
So it's correlated with the penalty.
Yes.
And the objective is that the penalty would then be a deterrent for someone committing a crime, that if it be a hate crime, that the person would be penalized to a greater extent than if it wasn't a hate crime.
Correct.
Okay, so thank you very much. So how does one go about reporting a hate crime?
The easiest and to me the best way is calling 911. I'm a cop for 25 and a half years now. And when I came on, people will remember that time frame from the 80s into the mid 90s when I came on, that the 9/11 system wasn't adequate enough. It really wasn't the level it's at now. Obviously, we've improved it greatly over the years, but you used to hear leave 911 for emergencies. Those days are long gone. 911 is an amazing system now. The best way is always call 911. Any other way, you can call 311. You could find a cop on the street. You could flag down a car passing by. You could walk into the precincts. But if you're a victim of any crime, and that perpetrator might still be in the area, call 911. It's going to get you the quickest response to the scene of where you are. And that is important for how the NYPD takes and handles hate crimes. We need that triggered response. We need the cops on the scene, preferably through 911, to get there, because NYPD protocol mandates that those cops, if it's a possible bias incident, possible hate crime, those cops have to call a supervisor. The supervisor has to call an executive, a captain or above. Our department manual is a binder this fat. It's 1,100 pages of telling you everything to do to be a cop. But hate crimes are probably the only, if not one of the very few incidents where an executive has to be on the scene doing the investigation.
Please define an executive for us.
Captain and above.
Okay.
And 24 hours a day, there's a captain working in every precinct, every borough in the city. There's 2 executives in every precinct. There's borough staff. So there's always plenty of executives around, but they have to get plugged in immediately because we need to make sure the patrol resources know what's going on and investigate the crime and catch a perpetrator if it's still possible, and that it's handled correctly in the investigation. That executive has to send it over to my office.
Got it. So let me give you an example, an illustration, and maybe you can help our viewers and myself as well in understanding what takes precedence and when HCTF gets involved and when it doesn't. So we often learn about arrests following minor disputes with name calling and disparaging remarks that escalated into a physical altercation. But while appearing to be one and the same, some are identified as assaults, yet others are categorized as hate crimes. So how do you determine which is which?
Some are easier and some are more vague. And we go back to that definition of a hate crime from the penal law, motivated in whole or substantial part by the identity of the victim. What is the motivation that made this perpetrator commit this crime against this victim? Now, the easiest example we always use is a car accident.
Mhm.
Somebody runs a stop sign and crashes into my brand new car. I'm furious. I get out and I start yelling at them. What's wrong with you? You can't drive. How come you didn't see that stop sign? Maybe I push them, or maybe I hit them because I'm so angry about them hitting my car. What is the motivation for that? I'm mad at their driving skills or lack thereof. But now what if I throw in what we call gratuitous slurs? After all of that, after me voicing my dissatisfaction with their driving ability, I throw in a slur against their religion or their race. Does that change the motivation for why I'm angry? I'm still mad that they can't drive and they hit my brand new car. That's still what starts it. Would I have just jumped out of my car and hit them because of their identity without a car accident? Possibly, but probably not. Would I have reacted the same way of people of a different identity group who ran a stop sign and hit my car? Most likely, yes. So we have to look at what's the shortest question to always ask is, what's the actual motivation for this?
So when we get to the matter of motivation, and again, we have this car accident as you laid it out, that he eventually, that starts out as nothing more than that, as bad as or as minor as it might be, and then it escalates. And people start saying things that could be quite offensive. And people can say pretty awful and hurtful things, but we live in a country that prides itself on our constitutional right to the freedom of speech. So how is it that some incidents involving very offensive or anti-Semitic language are treated as freedom of speech, while others are deemed to be hate crimes?
Well, as the definition says, to be a hate crime, you need an underlying crime. You need a crime to happen. And at the lowest level of criminality in that is basically going after somebody for their identity and either attempting, threatening, or actually making some sort of physical contact with them, even if there's no injury. So again, let's get into examples. If I'm standing on a street corner and I feel like espousing my hatred of any identity or all identities, and I'm using disgusting language about that identity and what my feelings are, and I'm just standing there with my hands in my pockets, I could stand there and do that all day. I'm protected by the Constitution to do that. But now what if I go after someone? What if I charge after somebody or I push someone while using that language? Well, now I'm clearly targeting that person. I'm taking that free speech and I'm adding a threat or an act into it based on the identity of that person. That makes it a hate crime.
Is there any difference between a hate crime and a bias incident, or is one and the same?
In some circles, the words are interchangeable. I actually said it before. Our patrol guide procedure, our department manual, calls it a bias incident. But obviously, we're the hate crime unit. They're sometimes interchangeable. Really, if you break it down, a hate crime is a crime. It's labeled by the hate crime law. A bias incident could be that me standing on a street corner espousing my hatred of an identity group. It's still biased and it's still an incident, but it's not a hate crime. A lot of organizations track bias incidents, which I feel they should. There's obviously more bias incidents than hate crimes because they track an overall sentiment and temperature of a neighborhood or a city of what's actually going on there.
Thank you. Can you give us like a behind the scenes of what happens when you investigate a hate crime? What does a police officer, what does a detective do, almost like a step by step from within the manual to categorize it as a hate crime, and B, to take whatever next step is then required. But that categorization as a hate crime, I know that maybe it's folks who are on this call, but I certainly have heard it from many others. The incident is being, here on the news, the incident is being investigated as a hate crime. What does that mean?
Well, as the procedure I said, when it goes from the police officer to the supervisor to the executive and then comes to my office, it comes in, the term is a possible hate crime, because really we're the ones who determine whether it is or isn't, based on case law, based on us working with our legal bureau, based on me conferring with the chief of detectives. based on the district attorney's office, and putting all of our heads together in, does this actually fit the hate crime law? So they're always going to say it's being investigated as, because it is. We could take a case and really not sure about it, and weeks later determine it is, or weeks later determine it's not, that it could be motivated by something else. A big thing with that is actually catching a perpetrator. We may catch a perpetrator weeks later, and we need the statements from that interrogation to determine what was the actual motivation. And then we'll classify or reclassify as we see fit in that.
So one of our viewers just posted something in the chat. If somebody were to scroll a swastika on the sidewalk, would that be considered to be a hate crime, a bias incident, or neither?
Another topic I can go into an hour for, but we don't have that time. It would be both. Obviously, it's a bias. It's a bias situation, but it is also a hate crime. In addition to the hate crime law, there's a charge in the penal law, aggravated harassment first degree, which is drawing a swastika, burning a cross, or affixing a noose in a public place. So it's very interesting because our criminal mischief charge, so if I write an obscenity about an identity group in spray paint on the wall, it's a criminal mischief. But if I draw a swastika in with any implement on any property, it's an automatic hate crime. And looking at the, and I'm sure you're going to get into it at some point, but looking at the statistics we have for hate crimes, usually every year, 50 to 55% of our hate crimes are against the Jewish community. But looking at those crimes, that 50 to 55%, about 80% of them are property damage, and 75% are drawing swastikas. A huge chunk of our hate crimes are the drawing of swastikas. Last year, I think there were close to 200.
200
swastika cases in the city in the year. Maybe a little, probably about 180.
Does it make a difference where the swastika is drawn? I mean, if, as one of our viewers posted, sidewalk. Another viewer posted on a garbage pile, slogans on a garbage pile. Does that fit into the determination of what is and what is not a hate crime and how it's investigated?
The law says that it has to be real property, which is a legal definition. Written on a garbage pile, probably not. Written on a car, written on a building, a storefront, a sidewalk, those would be defined as real property.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, to our viewers, if you want to post something on the chat that you would like me to ask, feel free to do so, to the extent that I can follow these things while asking questions and getting prepared for the next question. I certainly will make every effort to do so. And I thank you very much for your contributions to us. That's to our viewers. And back to our wonderful guests. Well, here's a question. Are there specific times of the year where there is an increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes? And that really goes into the next question I wanted to pose. And that is just a year ago, as I mentioned in my intro, we went through a significant spike. And David Pollack, who's on this call, who's our Associate Executive Director and Director of Jewish Security, and the chairman of our Community Security Initiative, David was really on top of all of those issues together with Mitch Silber and CSI, which was created just in February of this year. So back to the point, again, a year ago, we had this significant spike. So is it A, times of the year which make a difference? B, can we attribute the rise in anti-Semitism we saw before the pandemic to anything in specific? Some of it was around Hanukkah, but much of it was not. So again, two questions in that. Are there times of the year? And what happened last year? And do you anticipate that when this pandemic subsides, God willing, we're going to start seeing vaccines in New York City next week, that there's a potential for anti-Semitism to once again rear its head?
Michael, as always, 10 questions at once. Let me first start with David Pollack. I owe an apology. He sent me a beautiful digital background, as most people use in these. It does not work on my personal device that I'm on right now, so I apologize. It's beautiful. I thank you for the help with that. But as you started, Michael, saying that you're coming to this crowd from your office, I'm coming to this crowd from my living room. So I have to use my personal device, and I couldn't get that to work. So thank you again, David, and I apologize that I'm not using it. We have seen spikes in hate crimes against all identities based on holiday seasons for that identity. National, international events. Like one of the ones, we saw a spike during the 2016 election. We saw a spike during the 2018 midterm elections. We did not see too much of a spike during the 2020 election, which I can get into in a minute, but I think that's also with the decrease that's related to the COVID time period we're in. We look at the holidays usually as a target-rich environment. On a holiday, there are more people of that identity group going to, let's say, their services, synagogue, church, mosque, temple, whatever. There are more people out to be victimized. So we could see a spike there. Going back to the numbers, as I said, 55%, I think last year it was 52% of hate crimes were anti-Semitic. We did have an increase in anti-Semitic crimes by 25%. We had an increase in all crimes by 20%. But the spike that you talk about is interesting because I mapped it out. And we took 25 anti-Semitic hate crimes in December last year.
25.
25. If you go by law of averages for what we do, we see about 4 or 5 a week. So 25 is a little high based on the law of averages. An interesting note to that is we took 29 in October, but the 25 in December got more media attention and got more public interest. Why? Because it was around the holiday. Why? Because it was after Jersey City and Muncie. And mapping them out even more minuscule, driving the numbers down. In the first week in December last year, we took 4 hate crimes. That's on average. The second week, we took 0 anti-Semitic hate crimes. The third week, we took 0 anti-Semitic hate crimes. The fourth week, we took 9, and the last week, we took 12. So that number 25 for the month maps out to the 29 in October. It's close and it's similar, but we saw a period of calm and quiet followed by Muncie and Jersey City, and then followed by a spike of 21 crimes in New York City against the Jewish population. Also, the severity of those crimes, as I said, 80% of our crimes are property damage. You'll remember last year, the Sheepshead Bay area and like the Midwood, Flatbush area of Brooklyn, we had a string of hate crimes being committed by one person. And those weren't property crimes, those were pushing and shoving of Jewish women. So we do see this raise during, like I said, national, international events and holidays, and then it usually dies down. This year is a bit of an anomaly where we're down 30-something% in hate crimes as of right now.
And that's attributable to what?
Well, let's say 30% down in hate crimes, 50% down in anti-Semitic hate crimes. There's got to be some COVID connection in there.
Yeah.
These numbers do date back to before COVID. As of the first week in March, we were down 20-something% in hate crimes. So there was a decrease in the beginning of the year before COVID started. Then we saw 2 things. We saw the rise in COVID-related hate crimes. We took 24 reported COVID-related hate crimes, 23 against the Asian population and 1 against the Jewish population. But then with the COVID lockdowns, less victims on the streets, less perpetrators on the streets, we moved forward into less and less hate crimes. Then we moved into the George Floyd protests, which a portion elevated into riot behavior and whatnot. And since then, I think part of it is people who hate have directed their hate in a new direction, and it's not just Jewish people or not just identity based. It's politically based, which is not a hate crime. It's sections of the population. It's income based. So we do see this decrease right now that I hope will continue. I kind of, I was looking at numbers. I grabbed some numbers for this, and I was amazed that we talk about the property damage cases and 80% of anti-Semitic cases. We are down greatly right now in those property damage cases, but we're also down in assaults. We're also down in robberies. Those are very few of the numbers. Last year, even with that increase that I said, 26% increase in anti-Semitic crimes, robberies were down, assaults were down, menacing with a weapon was down. What was up was property crimes. We took 47 additional anti-Semitic crimes last year.
Right.
39 of them were swastikas.
Hmm.
That's not great. I'm not excited about that. It's still a hate crime. It's still an absolutely heinous act. I mean, in some regards, it may affect more people than a person-on-person crime. But I'm happy the violence is down. We strive to decrease violence. And even looking at this year, we've seen the articles even as recent as yesterday with the shootings being up to a 14-year high. But looking at overall numbers are down. Assaults are down. Robberies are down year to date in the city. Rapes are down year to date in the city. So crime is decreasing in a lot of categories. And I'm very happy that it's decreasing in hate crimes too.
We're getting a number of questions in the chat that I want to get to as quickly as possible. And this question merges with a question I wanted to pose in regard to training. Are all NYPD officers trained in how to respond and investigate hate crimes, or is training provided to investigators who are assigned to the Hate Crimes Task or HCTF? And how many officers and detectives are there in the HCTF that work under you, under your command?
Training, two different aspects of the training. All police officers in the police academy receive training on hate crimes and how to investigate hate crimes. And again, when I say investigate, I mean on the uniform response end, not the investigating the crime that my unit does. So they receive that training. I actually, which I'll get into in a second, I went to that training last week. I went to the new police academy class. I asked the inspector over there if I could sit in on a recruit class of how they're trained on hate crimes. I was curious to know how accurate it is and how deep it goes. And it was interesting to learn that they group it together with other blocks of cultural awareness, cultural diversity, police reform, and biased policing. So it's kind of like an overall topic that gets into what a hate crime is. Since I got into hate crimes, when you get promoted through the NYPD, through civil service test, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, you attend a training course anywhere from 2 to 5 weeks, depending on the rank after your promotion. A little while, about 6 months after I got into the unit, I got my unit into that training. So every newly promoted sergeant, lieutenant, and captain gets a training from myself or the second in command, Captain Tim Hollywood, on investigation of hate crimes. And there's also a criminal investigators course that's sponsored by the Chief of Detectives Office. That's for newly promoted or newly assigned investigators. We also teach at that class. So they are getting it in the academy. They're getting it as they rise up the ranks, and they're getting it as they become investigators.
And how many investigators do you get? How many people do you have in the unit?
My unit is 25 people.
And is it broken down into investigators, patrol officers, or are they all investigators?
It's 19 investigators, and then supervision, 2 sergeants, a lieutenant, a captain, myself, and a civilian who does all my admin work for me.
Okay, and also for our viewers, just to make sure that we get to the fundamentals, you talked about the police officer and the sergeant and the lieutenant and then the captain, and you stopped there. So I think it's important that people know that what is next, which is what you are, but please just lay it all out.
The first 3 promotions are based on civil service tests. You study that big fat binder I keep talking about, and then you take a test on it, you're ranked, and you get promoted to sergeant. You study the book again, get promoted to lieutenant, study again, captain, and then everything after that is a discretionary promotion at the discretion of the police commissioner.
Right, so there's deputy inspector, there's an inspector, and then you get
and then up the chief ranks.
For the chief ranks, from 1 star to 4 stars is the max.
Correct.
Okay, as a former United States Army chaplain, I had to become very, very familiar with ranks. Okay, a couple of the questions are coming in before I get back to my series of questions about copycat activity. One question is, does these swastikas happen because of copycat behaviors? Is there any investigation and any studies that have been done about why swastikas are scrawled?
There's a host of different reasons. Some are actual knowledge of a swastika and hatred. of any population, especially the Jewish population. Some are copycats, some are, hey, I saw this design, or hey, I don't know what it means, but I know it upsets people, which still counts to me as hate crime because you shouldn't be doing it to upset people. Some are ignorant to it. We work with a few different agencies, especially with Board of Education, trying to update the curriculum in school so they know what a swastika is, where it came from, the horrendousness of the origin of 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and the effect it has on people, so that we can get people to stop drawing it. Starting with kids, if we can get kids to understand the logic to it when those kids are in their 30s, maybe they'll understand the logic to it.
Okay. And another
Actually,
question.
sorry, Michael, if I just jump in, since we're speaking to Queens, you'll remember a couple of years ago, there was an incident in a playground in Queens where somebody drew hundreds of swastikas in chalk on the playground, and along with other Nazi symbols like the imperial-looking eagles and whatnot, hundreds of them. And we did the investigation on it. We were able to identify the perpetrators, and they were extremely young. I think one was 12, one was 13, and one was like 15 or 16. And I received a lot of backlash for arresting these kids. They went to family court. They're not going to Rikers and they're going to prison for the rest of their life. But somebody had to correct this behavior. And the New York Times ran an article that said they were doing childlike mischief. I don't think hundreds of swastikas count as childlike mischief. I think there's a reason behind that. But like I said, it was our job to investigate, apprehend, arrest, and then let the family court system figure out what kind of counseling or education these juveniles need.
Right. And another point which one of our viewers wrote to us about is media attention. Some people do it. Again, there's copycat activity here because of the media attention. And this is my opportunity to get my quotient of 15 minutes of fame.
Absolutely. We see media attention kind of goes both ways. We put out a lot of media in my unit. When there's an incident, we tweet it out. It goes to our public information office. It hits the news. When we're looking for someone, we put their picture out on the news to help identify them. When we make an arrest, we put that out to let people know. So I think it's a double-edged sword because the goal is a deterrent. Let people know, if I do something, I could have all the hatred in my heart I want, but if I act on this hatred, I'm going to be on the front cover of the news, and I don't want that. That should be part of the hope. But then there are people who it does get cyclical from there, that people see the attention it gets. People want their 15 minutes of fame, and then they jump in and do something to be recognized for something or be part of some movement, and then it keeps spinning. But the good parts of the media cycle spin is that maybe it gets more people to report. When we see an increase in reporting, and we had seen it last year, and it was an increase in incidents, definitely. But I'm hoping part of it is an increase in reporting. When you see in the news that things are happening like this, maybe that thing that you would have overlooked, that damage to your property, that swastika drawn on the wall of your apartment building, and maybe a couple of years ago, you'd be like, wash it off and then forget about it. But when you see things like this are happening in your neighborhood, maybe you're more likely to say, you know what? I could just wash it off. I would have just washed it off, but I see a rise in this, so I should report mine. Increased reporting to us is huge. I spent 5 years working in special victims with child abuse and sexual assault. That is probably the most underreported crime, followed closely by hate crimes. I'm sure hate crimes are vastly underreported.
Well, let's get into the reporting in a moment, but I want to get to another question that came in from our viewers, is that, can you comment on what your theory was behind the spike in anti-Semitic assault in Brooklyn in 2019 from the interviews that were conducted with the suspects? Is that something you can get into with us?
Some of those cases might still be open, so I can't get into what the suspects said.
But your theory.
My theory to it could be everything I said before. Target-rich environment. We had more people on the streets during the Hanukkah season and during the holiday season. We did have more in the media with Muncie and with Jersey City, and the attention that got. And every incident that happened could have caused more incidents to happen, or more reporting of incidents to happen, because it was this constant news cycle of things popping up.
Okay, are there any differences? You just mentioned that a couple of open cases, yes, but all the investigations of who are committing these crimes in New York City is known to the Hate Crimes Task Force. Are there any difference between who commit these hate crimes in New York City and those who commit similar hate crimes or other types of hate crimes across the country? Are we unique?
Um, in most aspects, we are not unique. It's a very diverse country, and just narrowing down on New York City, it's an extremely diverse city. So when we, match up our statistics of who's committing crimes against who, we have a very diverse victim group with the 10 identities protected, and we have a very diverse perpetrator group, ages, genders, races. It runs across the gamut. The only thing that does make us unique that I think we should all be happy about, we see a rise in white supremacy in this country. We see activity, we see propaganda. We see extremely little activity by white supremacists in New York. In my 4 years there, and the time I've worked alongside before that, in my 4 years there, I've seen 2 cases of perpetrators who are tied to white supremacy groups or share an ideology or have paraphernalia of it. The rest of them are random, diverse individuals walking down the street committing random, diverse acts against random, diverse people. So luckily, we don't have this white supremacy. I mean, I know we have an increase in white supremacy in New York. I'd be lying to say I don't believe that. It's underground, it's leafleting and stuff like that. They're not acting on it in a criminal manner, which I'm okay with. I'd rather just shut them down, but let's start with where we can.
Speaking of starting someplace, what started just a number of years ago with the advent of the internet is cyber hate. Is there are there any provisions for investigating potential hate crimes that were committed on the internet?
Federally, yes. Even locally, there is a terrorism charge depending on what the person uses the internet for, what they say. If it is an extremist group that's spreading propaganda, that could be investigated. It's usually not done by my office for a couple different reasons. Number one, if somebody is, we've seen Zoom bombing pick up, crashing into Zoom meetings such as this, and putting out the hatred there. A lot of the more vile acts could be covered under terrorism or could be covered under cyber crimes. So our computer crime squad will take some of the computer crime ones. We work with the FBI, and their terrorism charges are much better than our New York State penal or hate crime charges, and they have the reach. We work with our intelligence bureau, and they work with the FBI also, because if we have somebody committing some sort of cyber hate crime, the NYPD is not going to send resources from the hate crime task force out to Wisconsin to go identify this person and apprehend them. We have federal partners. We have partners in every agency, and our intelligence bureau works with the intelligence bureaus out there to go and investigate that. So some of them will take numbers on for statistics, but those are usually investigated by somebody else.
Okay, and the activity of white supremacism outside of New York is conducted by whom? Who does the investigation, and what penalties have been assessed to those white supremacist groups? Again, questions coming in from the audience.
If they're being conducted outside of the city, I don't have any jurisdiction over that. Outside of the state, I definitely don't. If white supremacist activity in other states are being investigated by those entities in those states along with the federal government.
Okay. You raised before the matter of reporting to the NYPD. Does the Jewish community report more actively than other communities? For instance, recently, with regard to the pandemic, there were a lot of hate crimes directed towards the Chinese community, but they don't have a history of being victims of hate crimes as comparable to the Jewish community. So are there communities that tend to report and tend not to report? And what does NYPD do? What does ACTF do in order to encourage people to report those crimes?
The Jewish population, I would have to hypothesize based on the numbers, based on the fact that 55% of hate crimes are against Jewish people. I'd have to say that the Jewish community is reporting. Are they reporting all? No, they're probably not. And we encourage everybody to commit hate crimes, everybody to report hate crimes to the NYPD. But we do see a lot of other groups that either have documentation issues, are not documented to be in this country, or even if they are, they have a genuine and legitimate fear of police because of where they come from. We see a lot in the Hispanic community, the African community, the Asian community, that we do see a lot of this undocumented people. So they're afraid to report to the police because of this mistaken idea that they're going to be picked up by the police and deported out of the country for being the victim of a crime. That's absolutely not true. The NYPD doesn't ask immigration status when we do an investigation. But some of the people who've come here as immigrants, documented or not, are fearful of the police because of the countries they come from. So a lot of these identity groups will report at a much lesser rate because of that fear. So what we do is we work with as many communities as we can. Our Community Affairs Bureau does a lot of outreach to different communities, and they have different people assigned to each community and the advocacy groups for those communities. We work with a dozen different partners. The Department of Justice does presentations. The FBI does presentations. As I said, our own community affairs, our school safety, the district attorney's offices. I've done presentations similar to this for every single one of those agencies and units to try to get the message out there. And the important part of it is, what I could applaud this meeting, the Zoom call on, is that my problem is always getting to the people who might be victimized. Mm-hmm. I could speak to you, Mr. Miller, and David Pollock, and a lot of people, but you're mid-level. I need you to bring it down to the people on the street. And right. You're doing that, obviously, right here in front of me. But we have to make sure that the people on the street get that message that it is okay to talk to the police. They are here to help you.
Right. Well, I think that we in the Jewish community have done a very good job of ensuring that there are positive relationships between our community, certainly our leadership, and NYPD. We know that law enforcement is key to our safety and security in our respective neighborhoods and homes. And I just want to get to one more question from the audience. And it's kind of a question that I'm developing from a comment that we received. Thank you from somebody who lives in New Jersey, but is connected to New York. Considering all that's happening in New York City and your relationship with the FBI, clearly New Jersey is to the west, Connecticut is to the north, even Westchester and other New York State counties going up all the way to the Canadian border, and Long Island is to NYC's east. Are there shared resources, best practices that are communicated from one state to the other and from one police force to another beyond the FBI?
There are. We have liaison relationships, not directly in hate crime task force, obviously, but the NYPD has federal partners, state partners enrolled in it, and then those people branch out. We have an executive from the New York State Police who works in NYPD headquarters. So if they need something on the state level, they go to that person. Well, that person has the liaisons to Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, whatever's around to branch out. The FBI also, when we've had international cases, I reach out to my colleagues in the FBI, and they reach out to their colleagues in Florida or Texas or Israel about incidents that are going on there to feed information back and forth. We also have Police Commissioner Shea started the REMI unit about a year ago.
Yes.
Racially and ethnically motivated extremism. They work with the Intelligence Bureau, and they are tracking extremist activity. They do their work and they track whatever they do. I can't get into their job, but the liaison program between myself and them is that when I get a perpetrator, I give that information over to the Intelligence Bureau so they could run social media and computer checks and see if this person's tied to anything. And likewise, when they get something, they're monitoring this 30,000 foot view of what are people saying. But if they see something that could have been a hate crime in New York City, they bring that information to me. And of course, being in the Intelligence Bureau, they work with intelligence bureaus across the country and the world.
Right. Well, we certainly have great respect for NYPD's Intelligence Bureau, for Intel. In fact, the executive director of our Community Security Initiative of CSI is Mitch Silber, who headed up the Intelligence Analysis Division within NYPD when Ray Kelly was the commissioner. And I mentioned David Pollack before, but I also want to mention that we have 5 regional security directors. And in Manhattan, Terry Byrne, who is a retired lieutenant and a commander. And in Queens, Seth Goodstein, who is a retired lieutenant. In Brooklyn, Adam Barish, who is a retired detective. Up in Westchester and the Bronx is Bill Hayes, who's a retired police chief of Bedford and Westchester. And out on Long Island, we have Liron Philippi, who's retired security from the state of Israel. So we have our folks out there. We also have an intelligence analyst on our staff. So we're in constant contact with Intel departments in the New York metropolitan area. But Hate Crimes Task Force is just so important to us in the Jewish community. And I can't thank you enough, Deputy Inspector, for spending so much time with us. I'm going to give you a chance to think about what your last message would be to our community as we begin Hanukkah tonight, and to thank our amazing sponsor for the Community Relations Corner. Of course, that's the Free Synagogue of Flushing. And they are serving, as I mentioned before, the Reform Jewish community in Queens for over a century. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to learn about their wide array of programming, and their beautiful sanctuary, social hall, and meditation garden are available for rent. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to learn about Shabbat and holiday services and weekly Sunday school. Once again, it's freesynagogueflushing.org. And my regular shout out to their president, Ed Shouters, members of our board, to Alan Brava, to Rabbi Gale, and to my producers of this show, our chief operating officer, and that's Noam Gilboard and Rebecca Grossman and Jennifer Glick, my 3 Gs. And I also want to thank Terry Byrne from CSI for, I believe he was the one who was the matchmaker here. Although again, your connection with JCRC goes back a long way. Inspector, a last word from you, please.
Oh, so many last words. Let's do the most important first. Happy Hanukkah. What do we got? 1 o'clock in the afternoon now, so we're closing in on Happy Hanukkah. I pray for a happy and a healthy holiday season, happy and a healthy new year coming. That is, the most important part. The other part that I always say is report. If you are a victim of a hate crime, if you're a victim of any crime, call 911 and report. If you witness a crime happening, call 911 and report. Work with the investigators to get something done. I said it to somebody recently from JCRC. I think I say it now because I'm getting older and grumpier, but much with my grumpy mug here. I'm that guy. I think it's a humanitarian issue. And I think everybody has the right to report or not report their crime based on their trauma endured. I get it. But I think it's a humanitarian issue that we all have to report our crimes so that we could stop somebody else from being victimized. I think that's the goal here, is to prevent another incident from happening on somebody else. So I'll say that, and happy Hanukkah, and thank you for the work you do, and thank you for those who jumped in on the call. I know it's not easy at noontime on a Thursday, but I appreciate you all being here to listen to me.
Thank you very much, Deputy Inspector Mark Molinari, the commander of the Hate Crimes Task Force of the New York Police Department. Thank you for spending so much time with us. And as one of our viewers noted, thank you for taking the time with us today and for educating us all. Indeed, we have been much better educated on the subject of hate crimes and how they're dealt with by law enforcement than we were prior to Community Relations Corner. I want to thank our wonderful audience who watched us live and those who will be watching us on the internet. I am Michael Miller, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Community Relations Corner. We wish everyone happy and safe Hanukkah and a joyous and meaningful holiday season, particularly to Inspector Molinari, for him and his family. A Chag Sameach, a happy holiday to all, and Shalom. Be well. Thank you.